Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. In continuing our discussion of interpreting parables, we want to talk about making that final step in understanding the spiritual application of a parable. And we talked about the first two steps already, understanding the context before and after the parable, understanding the physical language of the parable, and then now in this video we're going to talk about the spiritual application. And we absolutely cannot and we must not ever talk about the spiritual application before we first understand these two first. And we'll just see how this works in Matthew 24. Let's notice this. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells a parable about a slave who was left in charge of his master's household, but he became unfaithful. And this is actually in Matthew 24, verses 45 through 51. 45 through 51. Now, before we read the parable, though, let's just take into account the context surrounding it. In the surrounding context, at the beginning of Matthew 24, Jesus talks about Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed. He's actually predicting that this will happen. And it really does happen about 40 years later in AD 70. And Jesus talks about this as a judgment of God on Jerusalem, on the Jews, because they have rejected the Messiah. And since Jesus is on that topic of judgment, he kind of transitions into talking about the final judgment. And he talks about some principles of being ready for Judgment Day in the end that truthfully can also apply to the judgment on Jerusalem that Jesus is prophesying about, but they also ultimately are principles that we need to follow to be ready for the ultimate day of judgment. And so, for instance, in verse 42, he says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming." There's a lot that Jesus is talking about before this parable about being ready for Judgment Day. And even after this parable, in the context that follows in chapter 25, he talks about the parable of the 10 virgins, and they weren't prepared either for the bridegroom coming. And then eventually he's going to talk about the final scene of judgment at the end of chapter 25. So all of this surrounding this parable is about judgment and being ready for the day of judgment. Now, with that in mind, let's look at the parable, verse 45. "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household, to give them their food at their proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So we've understood the first step in understanding context before and after. The second step is just to understand the physical language, which really this is something very common that people in that day Jesus was speaking to would understand, that a homeowner, a householder, and an estate owner would often have a slave that when the homeowner left, he would leave this slave in charge. He was kind of the head of the servants, and he would be in charge of taking care of all the other master's servants while he was gone. And here's a case where this slave thought, well, my master's not going to be back for a long time, and instead of taking that responsibility seriously, he starts to abuse the power that he's been given, the responsibility that he has to get drunk and just live however he wants. But when the master shows up, and he wasn't expecting him, he faces severe punishment. And again, in that culture, punishment would be severe for something like that. So those are the first two steps. And now, really, the spiritual application is very simple, is that we need to be ready for Judgment Day. And God is going to return. Jesus is going to return in judgment. But right now, he's left us with responsibilities on this earth, and we need to take those responsibilities seriously. We need not to think that, oh, it'll be forever until God comes back, so I don't really need to be ready for that. I can just kind of do whatever I want. God says, no. You need to be responsible. God has given us free will. He has given us responsibility to live holy lives here on this earth, and we need to be prepared for his return. And again, this is not an allegory, folks. That's really the primary spiritual application. And most parables just have one main primary application. We can talk about other applications as well, but that's primarily it. This is not an allegory. The Jehovah's Witnesses cannot say Well, this is the faithful slave. That's the Watchtower Society, right? Any more than I can say, well, the faithful slave is President Obama because he's, helping the poor to try to feed them. I mean, that's just nonsense because that has nothing to do with the context. That has nothing to do with the original language and the original intention of the parable. So I hope that that's helpful and clear in understanding the spiritual application of a parable. And Lord willing, I'll see you next time.